I'm going to ask all of our speakers to come and join me on the stage. I think it would be unreasonable not to open it up straight to the audience for some questions. We have a limited time, I'm afraid. Yes, slightly.
Thanks very much. What a great line-up, but I'm really interested. I'm John Harley, an artist researcher. I'm really interested in this attempt to understand and grasp what we might mean and how we might operate the idea of abstraction. And but I can't help thinking about accumulation and dissipation, rather than the idea of moving things from one location to another, across a boundary. What we've heard a lot and experienced a lot are stories about the accumulation and dissipation of resources in terms of capital, in terms of energy, in terms of nitrogen, trophic resources of fish, moving down through niches. And so I'm very interested in this idea that we've heard from many people about niches, and whether we have sufficient understanding of the scale, the size of these niches, and the dynamic as we move between niches, exhaust one, and then develop and accumulate the skills and the capital, the nous, to start moving to a different and exhausting a different niche. And so the direction of movement between these niches seems to me to be quite relevant. So I suppose the question, and I don't mind who pitches in with this really, is about should we look to our understanding of scale and of these niches?
Quite like to respond to it. I'm not going to dream of responding to it all. Scale is a very critical issue, isn't it? The whole notion of, say, renewable energy is posited on the continual existence of the sun, but that isn't actually the case, I'm afraid. So ultimately, the scale we have to operate within is a human one. And that's often a different scale to most of the planet, which is operating very slow. The nature of human civilization is to accelerate constantly, but unfortunately the rate of sedimentation has been quite constant. And so, say for carbon deposition, our ability, the whole green movement is posited on the idea of decelerating to match natural processes. So that would be a time dimension for any niche. In terms of the actual resource space, it'd be quite interesting to model exactly where the whole process of science is affected in an endeavour to understand where a niche is going to be made most available through the production of materials. How can we navigate from these places we're stripping, these conceptual places we're stripping, to somewhere where there's a more reliable source for energy, for example. That's what I can say about it.
I think the interesting thing about the human, of course, is that we don't have a niche in the same sense as any other living creature. I mean, we have an extravagantly exploratory niche. And so, I mean, the kind of structures that you're showing us, Shaun, shows that this kind of crazy extent to which we find absurd ways of exploiting the most unlikely niches. And nothing else can survive. Any other questions? I feel that
I could answer Esther's question a bit. I'll leave it to somebody else.
I was interested in you've been talking about different forms of extraction, and perhaps the first speaker and maybe Esther as well referred to labor, which I think is interesting thing, because on one hand it is a sort of a subject, or it is used as a form of extracting, but also it is being extracted. And I guess I was wondering what your thoughts are in reference to that, because obviously most of the examples that you discussed would require some form of labor in order to extract. And I guess what Ian mentioned about the sharing of knowledge or sharing of understanding of the labour was also quite interesting. So that's, I don't know if
Labour obviously is the most essential part of the whole thing. It's humans that need the commodity, and it's obviously humans that have to extract it. As I said in my talk, there has been an exaggeration among many writers and many thinkers, very popular, that they are always the downtrodden and the exploited. And of course, the speaker on said, in a place like Pottersey and other ancient civilizations, slave labour was used. But that wasn't always the case. And it was very early realised, even among early civilizations, that the best workers were not slave workers, but people who were motivated and incentivised. And this has always been the case. And certainly, writers in the 16th century, most of whom, of course, were middle class, well-to-do, wealthy people, were often surprised that miners liked to go mining. They preferred mining, despite their poverty. And in fact, Thomas Beer in 1586 wrote that although they're the poorest in society, people envied them because of their charity toward each other, because of the way they looked after each other, and because it was a life they enjoyed. Also, writers about barmaidens in the 20th century, a famously exploited group apparently, mostly because of the writings of middle-class, well-educated people who visited mines and saw what they saw and misunderstood it, didn't realise that these women were independent, free-thinking, strong women. And interviews even with quite young girls who were working on mines as barmaidens showed that they preferred doing that job to easier, better paid work. So labour is an interesting thing to look at, and every bit of original research you do into mining and the mining industry shows this to be the case. It's full of surprises about the status and the remuneration of workers. Yeah.
I feel that I have to make briefly apologies out of it as well, because certainly in adopting the Gothic tone of Beckford in my introduction, I didn't mean to minimise the level of self-determination and creativity of the miners. And I think the interesting question is, you know, at what point does that self-determination suddenly change, or did it suddenly change, or what were the relations between the increasing capital needed to go deeper and to bring out more, and this kind of community which had developed over years and centuries indeed. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that. It changed at the end of the medieval period, really, when alluvial workings began to dry up. The independent tinner obviously couldn't work with his own cash, he's never enough. Mining is very expensive. And once the gentry, the merchants, the wealthy got involved and started investing in mining, which was necessary because of the sophistication of the machinery, the cost of operating the mine generally, the status of the tinner actually did gradually drop until they could become wage earners. So although they weren't quite as poorly off as is often said, nevertheless their status did change dramatically. And that was one of the big changes. Another thing about investment in mines, all of you who live in Cornwall remember the operation of Will Jane. Do you? How many remember Will Jane? Well, 2 or 3 hands have gone up. Must be somebody living in Cornwall still. That's good. In the 1960s, Will Jane was opened with a massive investment from Consolidated Gold, a Canadian company. They put millions into it, they paid millions in wages, they put millions into the local economy, and didn't make a penny. They closed, having lost what they put in. The mine remained closed until RTZ arrived. RTZ put millions into it, employed up to 1,000 people at one time. put millions, tens of millions in the local economy, and they passed it on to the management and the management buyout, and they didn't make a penny. But the people who did make money from those operations were the miners, because they were highly paid and they did very well. When they came to South Crofty, because they closed Roger and South Crofty, obviously, which had been going for 350 years, when they arrived at South Crofty among us, we call them when-I's. You know why we call them when-I's? Because every sentence began with the word, when I was at Roger. And so even now, in Camborne, people who worked at Roger and came to Crofty, I know them as when-I's. Just thought I'd tell you that.
Want to say something about this question of labour?
Well, I guess once we address the question of labour, one also has to simultaneously address the question of automation. The big production units on the American landscape are they're run by remote control, by computer. I saw one single worker in literally weeks of documenting them. And there is hopelessly an impertinence to I suppose, an interplay with dynamics of unemployment and unlabour, which has pertinence in Cornwall, I would think. I can't really sort of summarise it, but I just would like to insert it into the discussion.
Another thing which occurred to me with respect to this question is the fact that there's a certain kind of enjoyment, and this is what Alan was suggesting, I think, that miners enjoyed their work. And it reminds me of the philosopher Lyotard's book in '68, The Beadle Economy, where addressing his leftist Marxist peers, and specifically speaking about the English mine workers and the workers in the textile factories, he says, well, hold tight and spit on me, people, but they loved it, they enjoyed it. There's a certain type of enjoyment. That's what fascinates me in a way about this, the beginnings of this artificialization of human life and of culture, is that yes, it was embraced with abandon, and we shouldn't forget that. Esther, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I don't see a kind of opposition in a sense, in that all of the over the top sort of description of the terribleness of labour. I mean, but in some industries that is very true, and we saw the parts sometimes produced just simply out of ignorance on all parts, like the cancer of the jaw from the luminous watch industries and so on. Sometimes it's much more deliberate than that. I mean, in the German context, people pushed through for better conditions. Even in those fairly monstrous factories around the Rhine and so on that were producing colour, and they pushed through for various social welfare and the like. And I suppose if we go down a kind of capitalism is evil and everything it does is evil route, then we're very quickly going to run away from the facts, or just end up in a kind of moral categories, I suppose. I mean, as I see it, humans like to produce and make, and homo faber, humans are sort of labouring beings, and they, and sometimes it's under poorer, sometimes under better conditions, and I also, and it seems to me obvious out of that both the people who labour are the people who are going to make the innovations within labour. Sometimes they're not allowed to push those things through, other times they are, and other people who oversee them see the benefits of letting them have some autonomy and develop their processes. And radical change, camaraderie within labour also doesn't strike me as surprising, or a sort of counter-argument to understanding this is all taking place within a matrix of capitalism that produces certain social relations. I mean, exploitation is an economic category rather than their moral category. I suppose that was just what I wanted to say. Do you want to say anything on?
Yeah. Reflecting on what we heard today about extraction, I've seen two things. Firstly, that capitalism presents itself as a sort of an internal logic. Logic's internal to nature, so it's very hard to say, from the position I find myself in now, it's very hard to say, capitalism is external, it's something that's been put upon nature. It's often felt that capitalism is actually revealing a process which was in nature from the beginning. The Darwinian struggle is often a metaphor which is clumsily brought forward to justify sort of rapacious financial practices. And that's one avenue of thought that I can't realise any further than that. The other one is that maybe we could use community as to use Robin's model that he introduced of extraction of the void, the quarry and the deads. Maybe when we move into a human sphere, humans have to collaborate to actually extract anything from their environment, whether that's bison flesh, seafood or mineral matter. And so perhaps the community is actually a surplus product of an extraction. So maybe human communities are in some way the deads. That's a surplus of the quarried matter.
I think humans are certainly the deads of the exploitation of oil in the 20th century when you look at the arc of nitrogen use.
Robin, could I add something? Yes.
Thank you. This is a wonderful session. Thank you. Just yesterday at Mauser, we were thinking about the fact that, just following up on what you said, that the specificity of the target of the quarry, the size of the shoals was such that it took a village, right? So the communities in that sense constituted in the same fishing by what they were after. And of course, the labour was not hidden in that sense. I mean, in many ways, it's been very much male stories we're talking about. But of course, behind every hunter on the water, there's often many women doing the work of salting and preserving, but also gathering in ways that were much more interesting to me than what happened early this morning as people waited for the Coca-Cola. Yeah, Heather, you know, I'd like to hear more about the labour process on the shoreline there. And that made me think about, again, the specificity of the fact that coal seems to favour Karl Marx. But if you go to Carrara, for example, Carrara is a religion that if you travel down Italy, you see the glorious coruscating quarry at Carrara. If you go to Carrara, they're all anarchists. So, you know, coal gives you Marx and marble gives you Bakunin. And just a footnote on that, talking to Michael at the Pen at this fantastic story of the disaster at the head, right? He didn't know that that the Lifeboat Institution was the example that Prince Kropotkin, the great elucidator of the geology of Asia, born into the court of the Tsar, and his experience turning him into the father of the patriarch of anarchism, the anarchist formerly known as Prince. In his entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica on Anarchism, I think he mentions the Lifeboat Institution as the model for self-organized activity on the shoreline. So, and then just a last footnote.
Before we enter the labyrinth again, we have another question. Very limited time. Thanks.
Ah, yes, just the soundbite will.
Robin, is that me? Yes. And I've got my question, thank you. These have been really fascinating this morning and this afternoon. I'd like to pick up on this homo faber, this notion that we make things and we delight in stuff as species, it seems. How do we reconcile that to our apparent outrage at the destruction or the exploitation, or however we want to call it, to natural resources? But also, where does that sit within our continuing romantic exploration of a landscape or a seascape, in terms of how we view things. We still look for the sublime thing that overwhelms us, or we look for those clues. The images we use still reference that. So I suppose it's slightly two parts. We are implicated in this process of extraction because we like stuff. And, you know, we've got, how many mobile phones are in the room, for instance? You know, who's talked about coltan? Nobody yet. I think there's, somehow or other, you know, I get a bit worried we're going to get on the moral high ground about extraction's terrible, look at all these ways. And yet we have the value of people who work and their inventiveness and their pride in their work. And then we have a change in the landscape, and we create the landscape. It's not natural.
I think, just if I could say something briefly. I'm very glad you addressed the point, because I wanted to address also Esther's lecture. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'll say it again. I'm very glad you referenced it. I'm not going to answer it comprehensively, but I also wanted to refer to Esther's lecture. And I think, you know, the blossoming of modernity, the technicolor blossoming of modernity from the void of coal, and then it's almost returned into the void to be replaced by the blossoming of the LCD panel and the seduction of nature transposed onto the LCD panel. I think there's an answer to your question in that dynamic, which again will return to blackness and to the void and to whatever apocalypse we have left, essentially. But you know, the seduction of the landscape on the television screen is a kind of soma for the people in the face of an extraordinary loss of biodiversity in the 20th century. You know, it was 50% loss by apparently. But we are yet sort of seduced night by night of incredible seductions, glorious technicolor seductions of the landscape through panels. And I think somehow subliminally we believe them to exist. And we don't really address the landscape in any realistic sense. We are continually absolutely seduced by our iPads. And it's a dynamic which I think Esther might be able to answer where it might lead us to.
Does your work do you see your work as countering this by in some way kind of exacerbating it, or
I have to completely reassess my work after Esther's lecture. But I mean, I use the virtual to speak about the virtual states of existence. So I think it is a simultaneous engagement with that subject. But certainly I'm aware that these seductions of these panels have, in the same way as I think Esther's book and Esther's lecture is incredibly valuable, because I had not really acknowledged modernity through the prism of coal and colour. But I think to acknowledge post-modernity through the prism of extractions of earth minerals becoming LCD panels is something else I need to work through.
Yeah, strangely enough, it was partly through, I don't know if John knows this, but partly through a critique of his work that I started to develop my latest work, which is on liquid crystals and the seductive beauty of the liquid crystallized landscape. And for me, there's a whole thing about how the very operating of the liquid crystal is the fluid. The fluid and the frozen, you know, the liquid and the crystal, and how this marries also, for example, with things like the Day After Tomorrow film, this continual effort to reconstruct nature as animate and then deanimate through these liquid crystal forms, which give us mobility and stillness and play and work those through in various ways. So I think there are very strong connections there that I've been thinking about. And then, I mean, there is this memorial aspect, isn't there? You know, Frozen Planet is given to us as an end point. You know, we put all these resources in order to capture this nature that will never be seen again. But you know, what's brought back to us, of course, is this highly constructed, artificialized version. But that's the access that we have to it. But I don't perceive just a kind of outrage at a destruction, because what is more seductive is also the beauty of the devastation. And isn't that, I mean, this for me goes back to the Romantics as well, the Kulturlandschaft, you know, why the remains of industry, or the industry that's been sort of melancholically eaten over or reclaimed back by nature, or, you know, the earth seen through as polluted form also exudes incredible aesthetic beauty too, and that's also, it's quite, that's sublimity, isn't it? Sublime isn't just the natural cataract.
Yeah, so I was quite moved by the growing finish units and how they had actually transposed a nitrogen cycle into an entirely imaginary realm, powered by silicon extraction, well, rare metal extraction in China. And I thought that was excellent. And what I was particularly moved by was that the idea that the logic of extraction, pursued with human excellence, will take us to a planet that's totally exhausted of resources. And really, that means that we have to like transform ourselves into some sort of science fiction locust swarm and spread out across the galaxy in pursuit of fresh meat, effectively. And what better way of sustaining ourselves on these long journeys than virtual worlds where we can watch our depopulated next planet?
Perfect notes on which to end this extraction. Thanks very much to all our speakers.